Imagine a world where faith ruled every corner of life, yet behind church walls and castle doors, people indulged in the most forbidden and bizarre sexual practices you could ever imagine. What if I told you that medieval kings, queens, and even holy men carried secrets so disturbing that history tried to erase them forever? These weren't just private scandals, they were shocking rituals, twisted beliefs, and acts so strange that you won't believe they were real. Stay with me, because once you hear what really happened in the medieval era, you'll never look at history the same way again. In the medieval era, life was shaped by faith, fear, and superstition. But behind the rigid rules of the church and the seemingly simple lives of people, there existed a hidden world of secret desires, bizarre sexual practices, and strange rituals that history often kept in the shadows. At first glance, one might imagine the medieval world as cold and pious. A society obsessed with morality and religion, where priests dictated every aspect of life and people followed strict rules of purity. Yet the truth was far more complex and much darker beneath the surface of knights, castles, and holy crusades. Human desire continued to thrive in ways that were not only unconventional but sometimes deeply shocking. To understand this world, one must strip away the romanticized image of medieval life and see the strange contradictions between faith and pleasure, purity and corruption, sin and indulgence. The medieval church, which often stood as the most powerful authority, condemned lust, promoted chastity, and preached that sexual intimacy should only serve the purpose of reproduction. Yet ironically, it was during this time that some of the most bizarre sexual customs emerged, fueled by superstition, fear, and even power struggles. Many of these practices might sound unbelievable to us today, but they were accepted, hidden, or whispered about in corridors and bedrooms centuries ago. Imagine living in a time when touching another person in the wrong way could condemn your soul to eternal damnation. And yet in secret, the very same people who warned against sin indulged in the darkest pleasures themselves. This hypocrisy shaped a world where public purity clashed with private indulgence, and it led to some of the strangest sexual behaviors in history. One of the most bizarre aspects of medieval sexual culture was the idea of sexual sign and confession. Men and women who broke the rules of intimacy often had to confess their actions in extreme detail to priests. These priests, who were supposed to remain pure, were required to ask specific questions: how, when, and where the act took place. This practice of detailed confessions created a strange situation. People were forced to relive their most intimate acts while priests became unintended collectors of erotic secrets. Over time, these confessions revealed just how varied and unusual medieval sexuality really was. People described positions that shocked the clergy, practices that were condemned as sinful, and desires that could not be openly expressed in society. In a way, the church's obsession with documenting sin preserved details of sexuality that might have otherwise been forgotten. Beyond the church walls, superstition also played a massive role in shaping medieval sexual practices. Many believed that certain rituals could ensure fertility, cure impotence, or even influence love. For example, some women believed that drinking strange potions made from animal organs or herbs could increase their chances of conceiving a child. Others turned to charms, amulets, or even magic spells to attract lovers or keep a husband faithful. The belief in love magic was so strong that entire communities whispered about women who used enchanted powders or strange rituals to control their partners. These practices were dangerous because being accused of love magic could lead to charges of witchcraft, and yet people risked it because desire was stronger than fear. In noble courts, sexuality often mixed with politics. Kings and nobles frequently arranged marriages for power, not love, leaving many husbands and wives trapped in cold relationships. As a result, secret affairs and bizarre behaviors became more common. Some nobles hosted gatherings that blended feasting with forbidden acts, and while the church publicly condemned these activities, in private, many of the clergy themselves indulged. Historical whispers describe wealthy men hiring mistresses, creating hidden chambers in castles, and engaging in strange rituals of dominance and submission that mirrored the hierarchies of power in their political lives. Sexuality, in these courts, was less about love and more about control, power, and proving dominance. Among the strangest practices was the obsession with chastity belts. Though many modern historians debate whether they were truly widespread or later exaggerated, the very idea reflected medieval anxiety about female sexuality. Husbands who left for war or travel sometimes locked their wives into contraptions, made of metal or leather, designed to prevent them from being unfaithful. Whether these devices were real or symbolic, they reveal a society where men deeply feared women's independence and sought to control their desires at any cost. The image of a knight riding off to war while his wife remained locked in such a cruel device has become one of the most infamous, if not disturbing, symbols of medieval sexuality. Another unusual belief of the era involved the concept of animal associations with desire. Some people believed that eating certain animals or animal parts could increase sexual power. For instance, eating testicles of animals, like goats or bulls, was thought to enhance male virility, while certain birds were believed to increase a woman's fertility. These ideas blurred the line between medicine, superstition, and sexuality. Medieval people didn't have modern science to explain their bodies, so they often relied on bizarre and even dangerous remedies in the hope of solving intimate problems. Perhaps most shocking was the double life of the clergy. While priests and monks preached chastity and purity, historical records show that many of them secretly broke their vows. Some kept mistresses, while others were involved in far stranger and more disturbing behaviors. In fact, many church scandals of the medieval era revolved around sexual corruption, with stories of bishops who fathered children, monks who engaged in forbidden acts, and confessions of hidden sins that shook entire communities. The very institution that claimed to control morality was often riddled with hypocrisy and indulgence, making the sexual culture of the medieval era even more bizarre. But medieval sexuality wasn't only about hidden acts and forbidden rituals. It was also shaped by punishment. Those caught in acts deemed sinful could face brutal consequences. Adulterers could be publicly humiliated, stripped, or even executed. Homosexuality was often met with severe punishment, and people accused of unnatural acts sometimes faced torture. Yet despite these terrifying risks, desire could not be erased. People continued to find ways to express their sexuality, often in hidden corners, through coded language, or within strange rituals that gave them a sense of release in an otherwise harsh world. The combination of repression and indulgence created a strange paradox. The medieval era outwardly presented itself as a time of holiness and order, but in reality, it was filled with contradictions. The stricter the rules, the more people sought ways to break them. The harsher the punishments, the more secretive and bizarre the practices became. And while today we may look at these customs with shock or disbelief, they remind us of a universal truth. Human desire has always found a way to survive. No matter how strict the society, this hidden side of the medieval world reveals a society struggling between body and soul, purity and sin, faith and pleasure. People lived in fear of damnation, yet they could not suppress the most natural parts of themselves. Their solutions to this conflict: confessions, potions, charms, rituals. Punishments were as strange as they were fascinating. As we continue to peel back the layers of this dark history, we uncover a world that is far more human than the fairy tale image of knights and castles. It is a world where desire could not be silenced, and where bizarre practices thrived in the shadows, waiting centuries to be revealed. As we move deeper into the shadows of the medieval era, the picture becomes even stranger, revealing practices so unusual that they blur the lines between belief, fear, and desire. This was not just a time of knights and kings. It was an age where the human body was seen as both sacred and sinful, where intimacy could be celebrated in whispers but punished brutally in public. The contradictions grew sharper as society tried to control what could never truly be controlled: human passion. In this strange struggle, some of the most bizarre practices of history were born, carried out in secret chambers, whispered about in villages, and sometimes recorded in the dusty margins of ancient manuscripts. One of the most unsettling aspects of medieval sexuality was the widespread obsession with virginity. Virginity was treated as a commodity, something to be traded, protected, or proven. For noble families, a daughter's virginity was directly tied to honor and wealth. Proof of virginity on a wedding night could decide alliances between kingdoms, dowries, and even political stability. This pressure gave rise to bizarre customs. Some brides underwent humiliating virginity tests before marriage, often conducted by older women or midwives, where their bodies were inspected for so-called signs of purity. In many cases, these tests were unreliable and deeply degrading, yet they were considered necessary to maintain family honor. In extreme situations, a blood-stained sheet displayed after the wedding night was seen as proof of the bride's purity, and without it, rumors and scandals could destroy lives. The medieval world turned something deeply personal into a public spectacle, reflecting its twisted mix of fear and obsession. The fear of female sexuality went even further. Women were often accused of being more lustful by nature, a belief reinforced by both church writings and folklore. This belief gave birth to strange restrictions and practices designed to control women. For instance, women were often warned not to bathe too frequently, as it was thought that hot water could arouse sinful desires. Some women were locked away in convents, not because of devotion to God, but because their families wanted to control their sexuality and protect family honor. Yet ironically, convents themselves became centers of whispered scandals. There are records of nuns who engaged in forbidden relationships, secret affairs that challenged the very idea of a holy life. In some cases, nuns and monks were accused of joining together in secret gatherings where discipline collapsed into indulgence, a shocking betrayal of their vows. These stories, though often suppressed, revealed the deep hypocrisy and the bizarre ways desire refused to be silenced. Even in marriage, intimacy was not free of restrictions. The church laid down strict rules about when and how couples could be intimate. Certain days of the week were forbidden, as were holy days, Lent, Advent, and even Sundays. In fact, historians estimate that nearly half the calendar was off-limits for intimacy. Couples who disobeyed risked confession, penance, or worse. This obsession with control created frustration, leading many to find loopholes or secret ways to satisfy desire. Some men sought prostitutes, who thrived in medieval towns despite being condemned by the church. In fact, many cities had designated brothel districts, some even regulated by authorities who turned a blind eye to sin because it kept order in society. These brothels, however, were filled with danger, disease, violence, and exploitation. Yet for many, they were the only escape from a world that tried to suppress desire. Medieval sexuality was also shaped by superstition and medical beliefs that today seem bizarre. Doctors of the time, influenced by ancient Greek theories, believed that the human body was ruled by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Imbalance in these humors was thought to cause problems, including issues related to intimacy. One strange belief was that women needed sexual release to stay healthy, and that denying them intimacy could lead to a condition known as suffocation of the womb. Some physicians even recommended that widows remarry quickly to avoid illness caused by pent-up desire. Others used bizarre treatments, including strange ointments or potions, to address problems like impotence or infertility. Some remedies were harmless herbs, but others included ground-up animal organs, powdered insects, or even human remains. These treatments reflected a time when science and superstition were deeply entangled, and people's most intimate struggles often led them to desperate and bizarre solutions. Punishment for sexual sins was another disturbing part of medieval life. Those accused of adultery or unnatural acts could face severe and humiliating consequences. In some towns, adulterers were paraded through the streets half-naked, mocked, and beaten by the crowd. In others, they were forced to wear symbolic costumes that revealed their sin. Some faced fines, exile, or imprisonment, while in the most extreme cases, execution. The fear of public shame was often worse than the act itself, creating a culture where secrecy became vital. This secrecy, however, fueled even more bizarre practices, as people sought hidden places, coded signals, or strange rituals to express themselves without being caught. Behind closed doors, human desire thrived in ways that were both inventive and shocking, a testament to the resilience of passion in the face of repression. At the same time, sexuality was not always private. It could be a weapon of power. Kings and nobles sometimes used intimacy to humiliate rivals or secure loyalty. There are records of rulers who forced enemies to watch or participate in degrading acts, turning intimacy into a political tool. Some courts became infamous for their indulgence, where banquets blurred into orgies, and lines between politics and pleasure disappeared. These events, whispered about in chronicles, shocked the outside world but were tolerated within the walls of power. They reveal how desire was not only personal but also political, a way of displaying dominance in a brutal age. The fascination with unusual practices extended even to religious relics and beliefs. Some medieval people thought that touching certain holy objects could cure problems of intimacy. Others believed that saints' bones or blessed waters could ensure fertility. Pilgrimages were sometimes undertaken not only for spiritual healing but for physical or sexual remedies. This strange mixing of faith and desire created bizarre rituals where people sought divine intervention for their most private problems. The contradiction was striking. A society that condemned desire at every turn also tried to use religion as a tool to satisfy it. One cannot ignore the darker side of medieval sexuality, acts that today would be considered crimes but were often ignored or covered up at the time. The exploitation of servants, peasants, or prisoners by those in power was widespread. Many women, especially of lower status, had little control over their bodies, subject to the whims of lords or masters. Records revealed disturbing cases where violence was disguised as privilege and justice was rarely served. These hidden cruelties remind us that while some practices might appear bizarre or humorous from a distance, many were rooted in deep injustice and suffering. The medieval world was not only strange in its customs, but also brutal in its inequalities. Yet despite all the fear, superstition, and control, love did exist in the medieval world. Secret romances bloomed between peasants, forbidden affairs flourished in noble courts, and poets celebrated passion in their verses. Troubadours sang of desire, knights pledged themselves to ladies, and lovers risked everything to be together. Even in the harshest times, human intimacy found ways to survive. But often, this love existed alongside bizarre practices, shaped by a world that was never free of contradiction. A kiss could be both a blessing and a sin. A touch could be both healing and dangerous. And a desire could be both sacred and forbidden. The medieval era, with its mix of repression and indulgence, faith and superstition, purity and corruption, created a sexual culture that was unlike any other in history. The bizarre practices that emerged from this world may shock us today. but they also reveal how deeply human beings have always struggled to balance desire with the rules of society. They remind us that even in an age dominated by the church, castles, and kings, the most powerful force of all remain hidden in the human heart, waiting for a chance to break free. The deeper we go into the labyrinth of the medieval world, the stranger, darker, and more contradictory it becomes. By now, we have seen how superstition, faith, power, and repression shaped bizarre sexual practices. But in this next layer of history, the stories grow even more twisted. This was not only about love, desire, or sin, it was about survival, manipulation, and the very human attempt to find meaning in a chaotic world. In the shadows of monasteries, the halls of kings, and the huts of peasants, intimacy took forms that shocked, disturbed, and sometimes even defied belief. And yet, these practices reveal much about the human condition, our fears, our desires, and our endless ability to adapt to rules even when those rules seem impossible. One of the most disturbing features of the medieval era was the way intimacy was connected to power and punishment. In many regions of Europe, especially under feudal lords, sexuality was not a private right but a privilege controlled by the ruling class. There was even a controversial practice known in legend as the droit du seigneur, or the Lord's right, where it was believed that nobles could sleep with a bride on her wedding night before her husband. Whether or not this practice was truly widespread remains debated among historians, but even the fear of it shows how peasants lived under constant sexual oppression. Imagine a simple peasant family, preparing for a wedding, terrified not of whether their love would flourish but whether their lord would claim the bride as his own first. This myth, whether exaggerated or not, captures the imbalance of power that defined medieval life, where even the most personal acts were vulnerable to exploitation. Another bizarre aspect of this era was the deep entanglement between sexuality and medicine. The medieval understanding of the human body was primitive, and doctors often relied on a strange mix of ancient Greek theories, astrology, and superstition. Impotence, infertility, or even simple dissatisfaction could be blamed on the position of the stars or the imbalance of bodily humors. Treatments ranged from the mildly strange to the outright grotesque. Some believed that eating the reproductive organs of animals, like rabbits or goats, could enhance fertility or virility. Others mixed potions from crushed beetles, powdered bones, or bizarrely enough, dried blood. Women struggling to conceive were sometimes told to carry amulets containing herbs or, in darker cases, to drink concoctions made from animal testicles. These remedies may sound absurd now, but for desperate people who lived in a world without modern medicine, such practices were taken seriously. They reveal not only how little was understood about the human body, but also how desperation led people to embrace the most bizarre and unsettling cures. But medieval sexuality was not only about medical strangeness, it was also shaped by punishment and fear. The church's obsession with regulating desire meant that even married couples could find themselves in trouble for breaking the rules. Confessors' manuals, which guided priests in dealing with sins, went into shocking detail about what acts were forbidden even within marriage. Certain positions were condemned as unnatural. Intimacy during menstruation was forbidden, and acts that did not aim at procreation were considered sinful. Priests would ask invasive questions, probing into the most intimate details of people's lives, and demand penance for what today would be considered normal marital behavior. For couples caught breaking these rules, punishments could include fasting, public humiliation, or long pilgrimages. Imagine being forced to walk hundreds of miles barefoot because of something you did in the privacy of your marriage bed. Such extremes show the strange grip religion had over not just public life but the most private corners of human existence. Of course, these strict rules created a culture of secrecy, and secrecy gave rise to even stranger practices. Because people were terrified of confessing their desires, they often turned to underground communities, hidden rituals, or coded symbols. One strange phenomenon was the use of charms and love potions. In villages, wise women or local healers created brews said to inspire desire or loyalty. These potions might include strange ingredients like bat wings, frog legs, or even drops of blood. Sometimes, these charms worked not because of their ingredients but because of the psychological power of belief. A man who believed he drank a potion of passion might convince himself he felt stronger desire, while a woman who wore a charm might feel more confident in her power. But these practices carried enormous risks. If caught, the practitioners could be accused of witchcraft. And in the late medieval era, when witch hunts grew more common, these once secret remedies became deadly traps. Countless women, accused of using their knowledge of herbs and potions to manipulate desire, were tried, tortured, and executed. Behind every bizarre potion was not just superstition, but also danger. Even more disturbing was how closely sexuality was linked to accusations of heresy. The Church often portrayed those it considered heretics, groups like the Cathars or later the Templars, as engaging in bizarre sexual rites. Sometimes these accusations were exaggerated or fabricated to justify persecution. There were stories of secret midnight gatherings where people stripped naked, kissed in strange places, or even worshipped idols in obscene ways. While most of these tales were likely propaganda, they reveal how sexuality was weaponized as a tool of control. To accuse someone of sexual deviance was to destroy their reputation, making it easier to condemn them as enemies of God. In this sense, the bizarre sexual stories of the medieval era were not just about real practices, but also about the fears and fantasies projected onto others. The line between reality and rumor blurred, leaving us with a strange record of accusations that tell us more about medieval anxieties than about actual behavior. Still, not all bizarre practices were rooted in repression. Some were born from celebration and excess. In certain festivals, normal rules were suspended, and desire was openly expressed in shocking ways. For example, during the Feast of Fools or similar carnivals, lower-class people, dressed as clergy, mocked the church, and engaged in wild, chaotic celebrations that sometimes included sexual indulgence. In these moments, society briefly turned upside down, allowing forbidden behaviors to erupt into the open. Villages also had fertility festivals where symbolic rituals involving public displays of intimacy were believed to ensure good harvests. Though shocking to us today, these events reflected a world where survival was tied to fertility, and sexuality was sometimes celebrated as part of nature's cycle. It was a strange balance. Most of the year, sexuality was condemned and controlled, but in brief moments, it was unleashed in ways that shocked and fascinated. Another bizarre feature of the era was the obsession with chastity belts. While historians still debate how common they really were, the image of iron belts designed to lock away women's sexuality has become a powerful symbol of medieval repression. Some stories claim that knights forced their wives to wear them while they went on crusades, securing the key to ensure fidelity. Others suggest they were more symbolic than practical, used to mock or intimidate rather than truly imprison. Still, the very idea reflects the twisted view of desire at the time. Instead of trust, control was enforced through pain and humiliation. Even if chastity belts were rare, their legend captures the bizarre lengths to which medieval people were believed to go to control desire. At the same time, the courtly love tradition reveals another contradiction. While the church condemned passion, poets and troubadours celebrated it in elaborate songs and poems. Knights pledged themselves to noble ladies, writing verses about longing, devotion, and forbidden desire. These relationships were often not physical but emotional, creating a strange ideal where true love was about yearning rather than fulfillment. In some cases, these romances crossed a line into scandal, with real affairs hidden beneath the poetry. But what is striking is how differently the same society could treat desire. In one space, it was sinful and punishable. In another, it was celebrated as the highest form of beauty. This contradiction again reveals the bizarre duality of the medieval world, where love and lust were both condemned and praised, often in the same breath. And beneath all these practices, one truth remained constant: inequality. Women's bodies were policed, punished, and controlled far more than men's. Female desire was feared, shamed, and sometimes criminalized, while male indulgence was often overlooked or tolerated. This imbalance created a world where bizarre practices flourished, not only out of superstition, but also out of injustice. The strange customs of the medieval era may fascinate us today, but for many who lived them, they were not curiosities, they were cages. The deeper we look into the medieval world, the clearer it becomes that its bizarre sexual practices were not random oddities. They were born from a world of fear, faith, and power, a world where human passion was constantly at war with human rules. And in this war, strange practices, chastity belts, virginity tests, love potions, public punishments became weapons. They reveal a society both terrified of and obsessed with desire, a society whose contradictions still echo in our fascination today. The story of the medieval era's most bizarre sexual practices cannot be finished without diving into the darkest, most hidden, and most shocking layers of history. We have already seen how superstition, medicine, punishment, and secret rituals shaped people's lives, but in this final part, the world grows even more unsettling. This was the side of the Middle Ages where faith collided with fear, where kings and peasants alike participated in strange acts, and where human desire was both weaponized and demonized. To understand the complete mystery of these times, we need to face the extremes of cruelty, absurdity, and obsession that reveal just how far people went to control or indulge in sexuality. One of the strangest and most frightening practices of the later medieval era involved virginity testing. A woman's worth, her honor, and even her family's reputation could rest on whether she was considered a virgin at the time of marriage. But since the church and society placed such heavy importance on chastity, bizarre methods were used to prove it. In some regions, midwives or even priests were asked to inspect a bride before the wedding, examining her body for signs of virginity. Of course, These so-called tests were unreliable and often humiliating. The hymen, which was believed to prove purity, could break for many reasons unrelated to sex, but ignorance of biology led to countless false accusations. Women who failed these tests were sometimes disgraced, punished, or even cast out by their families. In extreme cases, they could be put on trial for immorality. Imagine a young girl, terrified on her wedding day, not because of her marriage, but because her entire future rested on the judgment of a stranger looking at her body. The cruelty of this reveals the dark obsession with purity that haunted medieval life, but what makes this even more bizarre is how purity was not only tested but sometimes staged. There were accounts of women using strange tricks to appear virginal, herbs to tighten muscles, sponges soaked in animal blood to simulate bleeding on the wedding night, or even carefully orchestrated rituals where relatives would cover up the truth to protect the family's honor. These practices expose how deeply the fear of shame shaped intimacy, turning private acts into public tests of morality. The medieval world was obsessed with purity, but this obsession often created lies, tricks, and humiliations that damaged countless lives. Meanwhile, for men, sexuality often became entangled with public punishment. In towns and villages, those accused of sexual crimes could face brutal humiliations. Adulterers might be paraded through the streets, naked, mocked by the crowd, or forced to wear ridiculous costumes as a mark of their shame. In some places, men caught in affairs were tied together in humiliating positions and dragged through the mud. These punishments were not only about justice, they were about public theater. They turned private scenes into public entertainment, reminding everyone of the church's control. Even when punishments were cruel, the community often gathered to laugh, mock, or scorn those condemned. In this sense, sexuality was not just controlled but weaponized as a spectacle, making examples of those who disobeyed the rules. Yet, in the royal courts, the bizarre practices were of a different kind. Kings and nobles, despite outwardly upholding the church's rules, often indulged in the most shocking behaviors. Chronicles tell stories of royal feasts where debauchery mixed with power plays. One infamous example comes from King Philip IV of France, who was accused of hosting secret orgies with his courtiers. Whether true or exaggerated, such rumors reveal how people saw their rulers as both symbols of morality and hypocrites who secretly indulged in what they forbade others. Nobles often used sexuality as a weapon of control, arranging marriages for alliances, using affairs to secure political power, and sometimes even employing seduction as a tool of espionage. Desire was not simply personal in the medieval elite, it was political. Behind every scandalous story of a court affair was often a plot, a conspiracy, or a struggle for influence. Perhaps even stranger were the ways sexuality was connected to religion itself. In monasteries and convents, where men and women were supposed to dedicate their lives to God, forbidden desires sometimes broke through the walls of devotion. There are records of priests and monks confessing to breaking their vows, and nuns accused of secret affairs or strange rituals. In one notorious case, a convent in Germany was accused of harboring women who performed bizarre rites in the dead of night, including whipping and naked processions. While many of these accounts were exaggerated or used as propaganda against religious orders, they still reflect the reality that repression often breeds secrecy. The more the church tried to suppress desire, the more it found its way into the shadows. And when it came to witchcraft, sexuality took an even darker turn. The late medieval witch hunts were filled with accusations of bizarre sexual practices. Witches, it was claimed, had intercourse with demons, flew through the night to orgies known as sabbats, and performed obscene rituals to mock the church. Women were accused of stealing men's virility, keeping demon lovers, or using potions to seduce innocent people. Most of these accusations were fantasies projected by fearful societies, but the torture and executions that followed were all too real. Sexuality was not only a personal danger, it became a crime that could lead to death. Countless women, often midwives or healers with knowledge of herbs, were condemned as witches because their understanding of fertility and desire was seen as dangerous. In these trials, sexuality itself became evidence of sin, turning natural human instincts into proof of demonic influence. One of the most grotesque accusations of the time was that witches used human body parts in their potions, sometimes even claiming they used semen, menstrual blood, or stillborn children in their rituals. Whether these stories were true or invented, they terrified entire communities and fueled a hysteria that destroyed lives. The bizarre mix of fear, fantasy, and punishment shows how sexuality became demonized in the most literal sense, not just to sin, but to Satan himself. But not every bizarre practice was dark. Some were simply strange attempts at dealing with human desire in a world that refused to openly acknowledge it. For example, in certain regions, mock weddings were staged where villagers parodied marriage, creating comic versions of ceremonies that often turned bawdy and sexual. These events allowed people to laugh at the very rules that controlled them, using humor to release their frustrations. Similarly, folk songs, poems, and riddles were filled with double meanings and hidden sexual jokes. Even when the church condemned such humor, it spread widely among peasants, showing that no matter how much repression existed, people found ways to express their humanity. Another curious feature was the use of sexual symbolism in art and architecture. Churches sometimes included carvings of obscene figures, known as shelanagigs, which depicted naked women with exaggerated features. Though their meaning is debated, some believe they were warnings against lust, while others think they symbolized fertility or protection. Imagine walking into a medieval church and seeing a shocking, grotesque carving staring at you from the wall. It was both a warning and a reminder that even in the holiest places, sexuality could not be erased. In the end, the medieval era's bizarre sexual practices were not isolated curiosities, they were reflections of a world constantly at war with itself. Desire was natural, but rules made it dangerous. Faith was supposed to guide people, but fear turned it into control. Power was supposed to protect, but it exploited the vulnerable. From virginity tests to chastity belts, from love potions to witch trials, the story of medieval sexuality is the story of how humanity struggled with its most basic instincts in a world that often refused to accept them. What makes this history so unsettling is not just the strangeness of the practices, but how familiar some of the fears still feel. Even today, societies wrestle with questions of morality, purity, and desire. The medieval world may seem distant, but its echoes remain in our fascination with these bizarre stories. Perhaps that is why they continue to capture our imagination, just because they are strange, but because they remind us of how fragile the balance between desire and control can be. And so, the mystery of the Middle Ages is not just about bizarre practices, but about the human struggle itself, the struggle to live, to love, to desire, and to survive in a world that demanded obedience. Behind every superstition, every punishment, and every strange ritual was a person trying to find their place in a society that both condemned and obsessed over intimacy. That contradiction is what makes the medieval era not just bizarre, but hauntingly human.